The US brokered deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates may be souring less than 2 weeks after it was announced. US news website Axios is reporting the UAE has called off a meeting with Israeli and American officials after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu opposed the sale of F-35 jets to Abu Dhabi. The deal is to normalize relations, and it's been hailed as historic by the US government. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is expected to discuss the jet sales during his trip to Abu Dhabi this week. Israel is the only country in the Middle East to have the US's most advanced fighter jet, the F-35. It's been American policy to make sure that Israel has a military advantage in the region. Israel believes it would be threatened by the US selling F-35s to the UAE. That is not the only issue complicating the deal. Iran, which Israel sees as an existential threat, has long-standing economic links with the UAE. Recently, there's also been increasingly open communication between the two countries. If the deal goes ahead, it would make the UAE the first Gulf country to normalize relations with Israel. Palestinians say it's a betrayal of their cause. Well, Marwan Bishara is Al Jazeera's senior political analyst. He's joining us live from London by Skype. Good to have you on the show as always, Marwan. Why do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu's apparent opposition to this US deal is materializing now? Because one would have thought the details on both sides would have already been known.
Well, not exactly. I think they have agreed mostly on principle rather than on the little nitty-gritties, the details of our comprehensive peace agreement, so-called peace agreement. But clearly on both sides, there is a lot of diplomatic theatrics going on now. I don't think it's very serious on the surface in terms of, they want to make sure, at least on Abu Dhabi's side, because of the growing opposition to the so-called peace agreement in the Gulf region and in the Arab world, that it wants to show that it demands respect, that it wants to be treated as equal. And on the Israeli side, there's also an understanding with the United States that when such deals happen, the United States should get a green light from Israel, which is quite outstanding when you think about it. But this goes back some 40 years now. Probably a lot of our viewers don't remember, but the United States wanted to sell sophisticated reconnaissance planes called AWACS back in 1981, 40 years ago. And Israel objected. And then they went on to this whole hoopla crisis between the two capitals until the United States won the day. But also Israel got a lot in return. And I think that's what Netanyahu is trying to do this time around. He's maneuvering to say that he opposes the deal so that when the deal passes, he will get a lot in return from the United States. But still, there's a question about why does the UAE need F-35s? To kill more Yemenis? To bomb Iran? Because if that really happens, I mean, on the Yemeni side, of course, we will know the disaster of the war there. And any conflict with Iran will mean that Abu Dhabi and Dubai, could be forgotten about. So any which way you look at this controversy and what's behind it, it's kind of all, to be honest, stinks.
Let me ask you, Marwan, about the involvement in Iran in all of this, because we were mentioning earlier that relations between Iran and the UAE do seem to be strengthening. At least there are long-standing links there. It is interesting to note that they managed to try and get this deal done, knowing that UAE does have those links with Iran. And of course, as we mentioned, that Israel is diametrically opposed to Iran. It seems very difficult to see how this deal is actually going to work in practice.
I think the deal is not viewed positively in Tehran. There's no doubt about that. But I think the UAE tries to keep the door open, if you will, for some sort of dialogue with various powers in the region, simply because it knows after the suspicious bombing of some Saudi installations and some of the energy commerce in the Gulf, the UAE worries about angering Iran. And hence, whatever deal is doing with Israel will anger Iran. And UAE is going to be maneuvering its way to make sure that it calms, if you will, the spirits in Tehran. In the meanwhile, if Trump is elected president again in November 3rd, I think we will see a trilateral alliance emerging between Tel Aviv, Abu Dhabi, and Washington under the tutelage of the Trump administration. And that will pose real danger to Iran and will escalate tensions in the area. However, if Joe Biden is elected and decides to go back into the nuclear deal with Iran, then I think the entire Emirati bet on a deal with Israel to improve its relations with the United States and its strategic standing in the region would have probably backfired.
Always good to get your thoughts on this. Marwan Bishara, we appreciate it as always. Thank you.